There we go. Good evening. Welcome to the House of Overthinking. It's been another episode of AGATHA all along, and I have some more thoughts to share. The first thing that I've had on my mind is the idea of dualities and how much we love things that oppose each other. Every time humans see a spectrum, they just have to reduce it to some kind of binary. And we do this in many instances. Even our religions are full of dualities. We create these pairs of, God and the devil. Celtic mythologies have, Celtic faith had the horned king and the goddess. There was also the Holly King and the Oak King. And there's, angels and demons. There's so many ways in which we like to reduce things, whether they're spiritual concepts or gender roles. We love having two options. And that's what made me really prick up my ears when Rio replied to the witches and said, "I'm not a green witch, I'm the green witch." And I thought, what does that remind me of? The green witch. It rhymed with the Scarlet Witch. So we've got the Scarlet Witch and the Green Witch. And I know that there are other minor green witches, but apparently she's the Green Witch, which I find interesting, considering when you look at the colour wheel, green and red are direct opposites. So scarlet and green are dueling opposites on the colour wheel. And given how intentional Marvel is, and Jack Schaefer particularly, I do think that possibly means something. And given that we know the Scarlet Witch, they said, is a being capable of spontaneous creation, I hope that was right, that I'm remembering it correctly, then if the Green Witch is the Scarlet Witch's opposite, then that would make her a being of spontaneous destruction. So she's somehow tied into forces of destruction and darkness, and she talked about coming up, so it's safe to say she represents some kind of forces of hell or the underworld. Another place that we've seen green magic be associated with the underworld is in the Norse mythology with Thor and Hela. Not so much Norse mythology, but the Thor movies. In Thor Ragnarok, we saw Hela using this, she had green power and she was the queen of the underworld. There could be something there, green representing death. Another connection I noticed occurred to me was some of you who have seen The Blood of Zeus may remember that Demeter, the goddess who went down into the underworld to rescue her daughter Persephone from Hades, is the goddess of the hearth, and she's represented by, fertility and the fecundity of nature. So she's represented by the colour green, and her daughter Persephone, when Persephone was trapped in the underworld, that represented winter, and spring couldn't blossom until Persephone was rescued. So there's an association there of Persephone and Demeter with the magic of green nature. Magic, let's call it. Who knows? At any rate, it's possible she could be an agent of Mephisto, which would make sense if she had to come and collect on whatever bargain Agatha had made. Perhaps she was there to extract the consequences of the bargain, prevent Agatha from cheating death. Maybe she took Nicholas Scratch instead of Agatha. Maybe there's been some kind of, had to be cruel to be kind thing going on there. That's I think a solid theory that there's some kind of counterpart going on between the Scarlet Witch and the Green Witch. I might be barking entirely up the wrong tree, but it's fun to theorize. And the main part of what I would like to talk to you about is something that was foreshadowed in this recent episode when Jennifer was referring to an experience where she had been invited to an obstetrics facility, and when she arrived, it turned out to be a trap. And the doctor who had invited her there instead abused and tortured her and found some way to bind her and take away her powers. And as horrible as that was to see, what's even more horrible is that there's a lot of truth to that. Before I get into that, I just want to tell you a story about a time that I met 4 witches, because it kind of sets the scene for what I'm going to explain. A number of years ago, I was backpacking through Slovakia, and I was in the central region visiting an ancient oak forest called Gavurki, which is truly a magical place. I say that a lot, but I do go to a lot of magical places. And as I was walking into this oak forest, a car of women drove past me, and I heard them all start laughing as they went past. And when I reached the entrance of the forest, these women were coming out of the car, and they said something to me in Slovakian, which of course I did not understand. And I said, "English, please." And this woman, very theatrically, I couldn't make this up if I tried, she threw out her arms and said, "We are 4 witches." And I had just taken a quarter tab, so this was perfect. And so I went, "Oh, amazing. Just hold that thought." So I took off my bag, pulled my shirt off, turned around, showed them my moon tattoo, which for the record is this. And she said, "Oh, you too." And what followed was one of the most special hours of my life, or half hour. I spent the next 30 minutes walking through this ancient oak forest with 2 of the witches. 2 of the others split off, and the 2 who spoke English wandered with me and were telling me about the plants, and they were explaining which ones were medicine and which ones were food. She said, "Everything you see in this forest, everything that people think is a weed, every flower, everything growing is either food or medicine. Nothing is wasted." And they knew all of them. They knew what every plant was. And so I picked mushrooms with them. I learned one of the mushrooms that's safe to eat and apparently very delicious to eat. It was a truly transcendent moment, right out of a fairy tale. And as you can imagine, I will never forget the moment I met 4 witches in a Slovakian oak forest. But what really struck me about meeting these 4 beautiful women who were so in touch with nature and had such love, not just for each other, but for the world around them and for everything in it. It just occurred to me that these were the sorts of women who in the past would have been tortured and killed. And I was struck by this wave of sadness at the thought of how many women like this have met horrible, agonizing ends. And I felt a lot of really difficult emotion to process, the thought of all of these mothers and daughters and wives turned to ashes at the behest of men who called themselves righteous and interested in doing no harm. The irony is just too much to contemplate. So, it's easy to talk about witch hunts, but there's this cumulative weight throughout the ages of the suffering that women have endured, and it's like a cry echoing throughout time. And that was one of those moments where I heard it, I felt it. When we talk about the witch hunts, generally people are speaking about kind of the 14th century to the 17th century, this kind of period between the 1300s and the 1600s, during which the persecution of midwives and wise women and women healers took different forms and evolved, but it never truly went away. There remained throughout this period of time just a sustained campaign of terror against any woman who practiced healing, any woman who knew herbs, any woman who helped other women through childbirth. And it reached such a fever pitch, like in the late 1600s and 1700s, there were thousands and thousands of executions across Europe. And this is not talking about the witch hunts that happened in New England. They were very small in comparison, but the wave of witch hunts in continental Europe that ran for about 4 centuries, the slow-burning Inquisition, took many. Some writers have estimated that there were millions of people killed, and about 85% of the victims were women, which makes the other 15% men and children. You wrap your head around that. In some German cities, an average of 600 witches was killed a year. It's nearly 2 women a day. Can you imagine that going on in your city? And in one day in Toulouse, 400 women were killed. There was a massacre of 400 women rounded up for consorting with the devil. And in 1585, in the bishopric of Trier, 2 villages were left with only 1 female inhabitant each. I mean, that's just genocide. It's a gender genocide. Can you imagine going into villages and killing every woman save for 1? And this is, the crowd who would call themselves pro-family. Most of the men and most of the women and men who were suppressed or killed as witches were healers, people who often played a really important role in helping the peasants stay healthier. There were large communities of people who did not have the means to access a physician or anyone who was, professionally untrained, such as it was back in the day when they were trying to fix your humours, trying to balance your humours. People would go to your local wise woman, your local healer, and the medical profession played a significant role in the witch hunts. We all know about the role that the church played. That's quite common knowledge, but it wasn't until recently that I understood actually what a role that the rising medical profession played in suppressing these fake healers and magic healers. And they supported these very barbaric inquisitions with medical reasoning, which is very similar to the way that the medical establishment supported the incarceration of people who were gay or lesbian or trans for quite a long time. Psychologists and psychiatrists called it a disorder, and they supported the mistreatment of large numbers of people who didn't ask to be born different. So the medical profession, for all of their oaths of doing no harm, have been party to some rather awful things in the past as well. So the witch hunts doubled down on a very long-standing tradition of hating on women and blaming them for everything that's going wrong. So if you got tired of blaming Eve for introducing sin to the world, and you got tired of women in general for being responsible for the lusts of men, you could find a local wise woman and blame her for whatever recent misfortune ails you. Or if a midwife had tried to deliver a baby and it died, or the mother died, well, obviously sorcery was involved, and so the midwife could be subject to violence or death. And so it was a dangerous profession to hold. The exclusion of women from medical roles was a rather scary precursor and foreshadowing of what was going to happen for centuries, of women being forced into subservient nursing roles that were traditionally required to do whatever they were told by the male doctor. So the medical profession, if they ever allowed women to participate, it was in a very servile supporting role. They were not holders of knowledge, they were just doers of tasks and followers of instructions, which makes me shudder. For the most part, the history of the persecution of witches has been recorded by those who persecuted them, which has made it very easy for them to paint all of these poor women as baby sacrificing devil worshippers. that has made it easy for the powers that be to obtain consent from the public to torture and kill these people. And many times it was the law for the church to be able to take any assets or wealth that a dead witch had owned. So the church had a very strong financial incentive to get behind the witch hunts, both Catholic and Protestant. It made the church a lot of money, and wherever there's a financial incentive, you have there's always going to be dodgy behaviours and people behaving in a corrupt manner. In the 1950s, you saw the same paranoia acting out as people were reporting their neighbours and their colleagues on suspicion of being a communist or a socialist, which is utterly ridiculous. As we all know, most of the people who are still to this day upset about those words have no idea what those words even mean. But it was a perfect example of the same paranoia that once afflicted people and needing to rat out any woman suspected of being a witch. The same thinking that we saw in the 1950s. Of course, I wasn't alive then, or was I? It's also important to remember the class dynamic that took place. The witch hunts were not peasants on peasants. It was less about mobs of torch-wielding villagers, and more about a very calculated campaign of terror by the ruling class on the working class. And if you think that has been left in the history books, well, just look at current American politics and you tell me if the ruling class has stopped trying to oppress the working class yet. I don't want to go into the details of the tortures and abuses that were carried out against suspected witches, because it really is unpleasant to consider. And I don't want to fill this discussion with those horrible details. It's stomach-churning to think about what people can do to each other. And it wasn't just witches, the people that they suspected of, doing harm with their witchcraft. Witch hunters were also very clear that any witch, even the ones who were doing good, they called them blessing witches. Even a blessing witch needed to be killed. And anyone, any midwife, any woman with a knowledge of herbs could have been burned at the stake, which is ridiculous. My mother has a green thumb. She knows all about herbs. She has a way with plants. By the standards of those centuries, my own good Christian mother would have been burned at the stake as a witch, which was ridiculous. People love control, and the patriarchal systems that have been in control for a long time have very nefarious ways of maintaining that control. At the time, the church didn't like the suggestion that anyone could heal people except for God. And so it was, outside the scope of what God allowed. And again, you see the same thinking today. There are many religious communities, many sects and minor denominations that do not believe in seeking medical help because they believe that it's somehow a prideful sin to not trust in God to bring healing and to bring miracles. My brother's friend died of cancer when they were teenagers, and the family were unable to let go of him because they believed that God was going to heal him right up until the end. And just recently, there was a case here in Australia where a young girl with diabetes, I believe she was about 8 years old, she died after her parents and other members of their church congregation withheld her diabetes medication, believing that God would heal her. And so they prayed over her as she became sicker and sicker, and they just kept believing that faith would heal their daughter, and in the end they died, and a bunch of people are going to prison. So what a wonderful outcome from that way of thinking. Back to midwives. The association of the witch with the midwife was very, very strong. And the witch hunters Crane and Springer wrote that no one does more harm to the Catholic Church than midwives. Can you believe that? Can you imagine thinking that the greatest enemy of the church is women who deliver babies? But these midwives offered an alternative to having your baby, delivered by angry nuns, or at any rate, it took control out of the hands of the men who wanted to be in charge of things. And the church's response to the suffering of the working class and the peasantry, well, you may be able to guess what it was. Thoughts and prayers, and platitudes about how they would suffer less torment in the afterlife. And this is getting a little bit tragic, constantly remembering how none of these modes of thinking have actually died out. They've just changed form. Mother Teresa was often accused of kind of collecting people who were homeless and suffering, but then denying them the very same medical care that she was privileged enough to receive. And she would say things like, suffering brings you closer to Christ. It hasn't really changed at all. So back then, just the same as Mother Teresa, receiving medical care herself and then denying it to the peasants. Back in the day, the church wasn't against medical treatment. It was okay if you were in the upper classes receiving medical treatment. It was okay for men to be providing healing under the auspices of the church, but women providing healing to the lower classes was not okay. The church needed to be in control of whatever was happening. And they genuinely believed that they were not attacking medicine, that they were attacking magic. As always, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And to be fair, of course, there was plenty of superstition and magical thinking and all sorts of, I'm sure, nonsensical practices that were taking place. But, we are talking about a period of time when, the doctors were still using astrology and alchemists were trying to turn lead into gold. So quite often the witches and the wise women had a better understanding of muscles and bones and herbs and plants than some of these so-called, doctors and scientists who were still in a very fledgling stage of scientific advancement. Another really ugly factor behind why it was considered witchcraft to be a midwife is that the church had a doctrine that because Eve was to blame for bringing sin into the world, that God had commanded for all women to be punished for the rest of time by increased suffering in childbirth. And yes, there is scripture in the Bible that suggests as much, but it's absolutely barbaric to imply that God wants women to suffer and that anyone relieving her suffering is sinning. So by that definition, giving painkillers to a woman going through a difficult labor would be demonic and sorcerous. For a long time, the church suppressed the medical profession from rising, kind of from around between the 1600s and the 1200s. The church actively stood against the development of medicine as a respectable profession. But then, after contact with the Arab world, which was much more culturally and scientifically advanced, this period of enlightenment really kind of took off in Europe, and the Age of Reason really started. So we have a lot to thank Arab culture for in regards to European culture, which I'm sure would upset a lot of people if they really understood the truth about that. So one of the things that worked against midwives in particular when healers and wise women were being persecuted is that the medical profession, naturally, they first went after their direct competitors. And that wasn't the local wise woman, that was more likely to be someone who was operating in the upper class. and that would be more likely an educated midwife or a literate woman healer, someone who perhaps had some assets, had some learning. They were the ones who were more of a threat to these men, and so they were the ones most likely to be accused of witchcraft and killed. They were called at one point worthless and presumptuous women who usurped the medical profession. That's a lot of butthurt. So there was a very unholy union between the church, the state, and the medical profession, kind of driving the witch trials. That awful unholy trinity kind of reached full bloom in the witch trials, and the doctor was held up as the medical expert, and anything that they couldn't cure, of course, had to be some kind of sorcery. So that is a high-level overview of how this became this, and I strongly suggest that you find more information about this in the pamphlet Witches, Midwives and Nurses by Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English. It contains all the information that I've told you and a whole lot more as well. It really outlines the plight of women and women healers throughout the centuries, and it's information that a lot of people should know, especially Christians who have received this hatred of witches and witchcraft as part of their conservative culture. I grew up a Christian and a very conservative one, and I thought witches were everywhere and that there were covens working black magic and sacrificing babies, all of the paranoid, crazy stuff I believed. And it really makes me sad to think that for all that time, I believed the propaganda and the brainwashing that comes from the men responsible for torturing and murdering these women. I would much rather be on the side of the women who were tortured and murdered than the men who did it to them. So this is one of the reasons why I'm really thrilled that AGATHA all along is tapping into some realness. It's really not just playing around in the shallow waters of superhero blasts and power beams. They really are exploring what women have gone through, and I hope that the story of Jennifer Hale really goes into more detail about what I've just said. It's a tragic element of our history that has been kind of quietened down in the history books for the reasons that I've discussed, so I won't go over them again. But I hope that this has been an enriching discussion for you. I hope that it informs your viewing of AGATHA all along, and that it gives you a deeper sense of empathy for what a lot of women have gone through in the past. With that, I wish you sweet dreams. And let's hope that the next episode brings us everything we dreamed of. Good night.